Okay. Well, maybe maybe it's time to start. So, warm greetings from the Warburg Institute, and welcome to the first session of our series, European Magic and its Tradition, organized by Dr. Agatha Paluk from the Freie Universität of Berlin, and myself, François Quiviger, from the Warburg Institute. For our first meeting on classical and Christian magic, it seemed quite appropriate to focus on the Renaissance magus because it is a figure which actually emerged at the Warburg Institute from the works of Francis Yates and which has been recently revisited and expanded in Professor Grafton's recent book, Magus, the Art of Magic from Faustus to Agrippa, Harvard 2023. Which we will discuss today, and I'll show you the table of content. Let me give you a brief outline for this evening. We will discuss Magi and magic for about an hour with our guest, followed by a 30-minute question and answer session where you, the audience, will have a chance to ask your questions to our panel. Given our limited time, I'll keep the introduction brief, but I'm really, truly delighted and honored to welcome Professor Anthony Grafton from the University of Princeton, whose long-standing and outstanding work covers most aspects of the Renaissance and who I am sure is familiar to you. He's coming along with the equally accomplished Sergius Kodera from the University of Vienna and Catherine Ryder from the University of Exeter. All have written extensively on early modern magic and cultural history and have very graciously agreed to share their expertise with us. Allow me very briefly, before we move into the conversation, to introduce the series. Our aim is to provide a snapshot of the current state of research and knowledge on early modern magic. We think this is rather crucial because the perception of magic as a subject of academic research has evolved significantly across generations of scholars. Once viewed as opposed to religion, magical practices and beliefs were often characterized as evidence of fading superstition, soon to be discarded by scientific progress. Now, this earlier perspective have obviously been challenged by the emergence of Renaissance learned magic associated with important thinkers such as Pico, Marsilio Ficino, and Giordano Bruno, who surely can't be accused of being superstitious and unrefined in their thoughts. Furthermore, things have changed as scholarly boundaries have expanded. We've moved from a narrow history of science, which excluded anything not considered scientific, to a broader history of knowledge, which encompasses and which acknowledges all contribution from philosophical and mystical speculation, invocations, method of harnessing natural forces, to even domestic recipe books. So we should really begin with a definition of magic, and Cornelius Agrippa gives it very easily. Magic is a discipline merging theology, astrology, and natural science. It is therefore grounded in an active knowledge of the mind, of the sky, and of the earth. Now, this kind of synthesis surely explains magic's role as the foundation of modern science. However, the practices of Renaissance magi were far more complex than this theoretical statement would suggest. And this is precisely, Tony, the purpose of your book. That is, as you write, looking at magic through its actors. So perhaps you would like to begin by reflecting on the connections and the tensions between the theory and the practice of magic and the outcome of these tensions.
Well, thank you so much, François, and thank you very much for having me, and my thanks to my interlocutors. Magic is so immense as to left to scorn any effort at a single definition, and magical practices are so diverse in what we might call European and Mediterranean culture, that again, it's really not even possible to give a crisp definition. What is clear is that practices are omnipresent. though not all of them are omnipresent, but they're present in all periods. They're present in all communities we know about. They're immense in variety, and they run from very simple things like the sieve you use to find a lost object, to more complicated and rituals which you might use to find out someone who's harming you. Uh, Theories come in and out. There are complex theories of magic and its relation to other studies in the late antiquity. Again, in the 12th and 13th centuries, there's an immense growth of theoretical attention to magic. And in the period I know best, the 15th and 16th centuries, there is not only an effort to re-theorize magic, but also to bring theory and practice together, which can, I think, only be done somewhat imperfectly. So I don't think the theory ever fully encompasses the practice. Reading Agrippa, it's hard often to see the relation between the overarching structures of theory and the granular detail of practice for healing a sore throat. And I think that that's part of the story. What interested me was this effort in the 15th and 16th centuries. Would Frances Yates put her finger on it? I don't think we'd make the same definition, but she said something is happening here. Magic is becoming public and performing in public and making claims in public in a way it hadn't done before. She could not be aware, as one can now, and we'll talk about this with Catherine Ryder, of the vast fertility and range of medieval magic. And she simply didn't know about that. But I think, as always, she had a wonderful instinct for the important point. And what I tried to do was to just working with some of the more influential figures in the late 15th and 16th centuries and early 16th centuries, just to get a sense of how they constructed a discipline, how far the construction worked, what traditions they drew on. I tried to find evidence of traditions being drawn on that weren't, so far as I knew, present to the same extent in high medieval magic, and that was really the enterprise. So what I hope to do was to tie Faustus, who has always been seen, especially in Germany, as a very popular, lightweight performer, to Agrippa, to see the connection between someone who is selling magical services in taverns and using them to scare students, and someone who is a serious thinker building a theoretical structure.
Thank you. Well, maybe Catherine, you have some observation precisely on the medieval sources of Renaissance magic.
Yeah, sure. I really enjoyed reading the book. And one of the things that I thought coming at this as a medievalist is that it speaks really interestingly to the work that's been done since Francis Yates, as you say, on medieval learned magic. It's a field that's developed hugely in the last 20 to 30 years. So we know a lot more about what these texts are, what's circulating, who reads them, how they're transmitted. We have some editions, we have some studies that kind of relate them to religious culture, to manuscript culture, history of science, ideas about gender and masculinity, and lots of really interesting things. There are still huge gaps. It's still a field where there's a lot to be done. But I thought, for me, one of the things the book explores really interestingly is the way these magi of the 15th and 16th centuries draw on those traditions, although they also add a lot more. And they also draw on sort of earlier writers like Roger Bacon, who think about magic and try to work out if it's legitimate or not, and where you draw the line between what's legitimate and what isn't. And I wanted to ask you, I guess, a little bit more about that aspect. They do draw on these earlier texts and ideas, but equally, these Renaissance works, they do look a little bit different. So I wondered if you could say a little bit more about what's new, what isn't, what's really distinctive about this kind of late 15th to early 16th century period.
Well, I think many things are very similar. One is the pervasive role of learned astrology,
Mm.
which doesn't by any means have to be magical. Indeed, in the Malleus Maleficarum, at one point, Kramer says, astrology tells us how the angels of the planets protect good people at God's will, which is a way of doing astrology that would have surprised a lot of astrology's critics. But I think that, the astrological practice of using talismans, for example, is one that just goes along, it changes over time, but it's present at all times. Practices like suffumigation, which are much older than the Middle Ages, are part of learned magic all the way. A couple of things struck me as novel. One is the effort of someone like Pico to legitimate magic. Now, there's always this distinction in high medieval magic between natural magic and magic which involves the use of unknown powers of natural objects or beings, and the forms of magic which involve communication with beings. And the first, even Nicholas of Cusa, who's a sharp critic of magic, sees the first kind as licit, and the second kind is not. Pico, confronting Augustine, confronts the passage in the City of God where Augustine says, pagans have all kinds of shiny names for magic. They call it magia, they call it gaetea, they call it theurgia, and it's all diabolical. And Pico, in one of the strongest readings I know, takes this and turns it around. He says, no, his pagans actually, there are actually two ancient sort of traditions of magic. There's Gaetea, that's terrible, but there's Magia, that's good. And Pico's revaluation of magic, it seems to me, is theoretically, a tremendously important step. And I think it both reflects and influences the way other people are beginning to think of magic. So there's a kind of self-conscious effort to say magic in a much more direct way than even, say, Albertus Magnus was willing to. This is a powerful, licit way of interacting with the universe. And I do think so far that seems to me to be a novelty, even as many of the practices are not.
Yeah, and certainly reading earlier, a lot of my work's been on kind of earlier theological texts, and nobody ever says Augustine is wrong. They might say that maybe he could be interpreted slightly differently, but that kind of confidence and the willingness to sort of depart from those authorities is really, really interesting.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and something else you talk about, I suppose, linked to that, this point about confidence is the fact that they're willing to talk so publicly about magic. They write these texts under their own names. They don't seem worried about punishment. And you start to see, odd glimmerings of this earlier in the kind of 14th, 15th centuries, with someone like John of Morigny, whose work has been so interestingly discovered by Claire Fanger and Nicholas Watson. And you start to get these writers writing on your own, down to their own names. It doesn't go very well for John. His book gets condemned, although he seems to escape. But yes, this new confidence to say, yes, this is me, and magic is a good thing, and it's something I'm interested in writing about, really does seem new. And do you have any thoughts on how are they able to do that? What lies behind this kind of new confidence?
I think one attitude which is new and which strikes me as it's very prominent in Agrippa, for example, is the attitude that you can really transform nature by human action. And that seems to me to be an attitude which, again, exists beforehand. I don't think it would have surprised V.R. Donicourt to be told that you could change nature through human action in important ways. But the directness with which it's said, and I actually trace a passage that starts out in Alberti's treatise on architecture, where he evokes the power of humanity to cut peninsulas off from the mainland and make islands, to tunnel through the earth, to make artificial mountains, to really change the face of nature. And that for him is connected with the powers of architecture. It's connected with the ability of Brunelleschi to make a dome, as he says, big enough to shelter the whole population of Tuscany. It's connected, no doubt, with the military architects and engineers of his time who were transforming military tactics and building. But it's a very powerful passage, and the Magi take it up. It's in Agrippa, it's in Francesco Giorgi, never cited, never identified as a quotation, but that, of course, is also a standard thing in the period. The informed reader would see the connection that's being made. So somehow the successes of engineering and the powers of magic seem to be seen, portrayed at least, as being connected and all part of the great human power, which, for Agrippa, for example, was responsible for Stonehenge. I mean, he talks briefly about, the extraordinary Stonehenge, which must show the power of ancient humans. So in that way, I think that's part of it. That give those powers could seem eerie. Brunelleschi scared the gentlemen of the Opera of the Florentine Cathedral by saying he could build his dome without scaffolding, without centering, and they thought he was a lunatic. So, of course, he wasn't. But so, in some way, this is powerful stuff. Beyond that, I think the other thing I'd point to is the way in which early modern people, and I think we sometimes do the same, are able to believe contradictory things at the same time. So their loyalties are labile and flexible. So Agrippa can defend magic, and then after he's finished with his book, write a thing saying, well, of course, this is all rubbish. It's diabolical. I didn't mean a word of it. I get a sense in which some of these writers, at least, I don't think this of Pico. He changes his mind sometimes, but I think he's someone who's very much a person of conviction when he has a conviction. But I think some of them are very fluid and they're able to move from one stance to another. So one way they can get out of this by saying, well, I didn't really mean any of it. This is in much the same way that Osiander puts the preface on Copernicus saying, don't worry, folks, this is just a hypothesis, which Copernicus would have totally disagreed with, but which is one of the things I think that enables Copernicus's book to circulate quite freely, is that it's got this misleading announcement to readers. So I think that that's also part of it. But it is really strange. Agrippa is a very respectable character. He's an Erasmian religious reformer. He's a consulting engineer. He's a person of consequence, yet not too long after his death, owning a copy of his book is already an act that will get you in deep trouble with the Inquisition. So and his book is reprinted by these semi-clandestine publishers who circulate that and other works which are anonymous or pseudonymous, and they're really part of the underground of letters. So I think I can't claim fully to understand it. In a way, that's why I started with Faustus, who is clearly that sort of character.
Yeah, it's curious, isn't it? And that I don't believe it. Those kind of disclaimers. I've been doing some work on Inquisition records, and you find them again and again because this is one way to get the Inquisitors to let you off the hook. You say, "Oh well, I never really meant it. It was just a joke. I never believed it." And yeah, but as you say, they seem able to kind of hold all these different ideas at once. And I wonder if some of that's because they're kind of steeped in this anti-magical discourse as well, aren't they? The same the theologians who write, or people like Nicholas of Cusa who writes, magic is terrible, all magic is terrible, all magic is demonic. They're coming very much from the same kind of intellectual world as these Renaissance magi, aren't they? And it must be very difficult for them to kind of think their way out of that,
No,
or at least not to address it.
I mean, I'm often struck by how close very different territories are. where someone like Francesca Romana has angels protecting her and demons throwing her up in the air and on the ground and beating her, where in the Malleus Maleficarum, Kramer states both that women are very holy, and the holiest women are sometimes in the most danger from the devil, and yet women are also temptresses and they're also easily corrupted. So these contradictory views and
Mm.
this sense that for example, some of the things that mystics do and some of the things that practitioners of the Ars Notoria do don't look to a modern reader all that different, yet they're clearly radically different in the eyes of 15th or 16th century readers. And so I think there's also ways in which magic is close to other things, uh,
Mm.
and that also may lend it some legitimacy.
Yeah, and I think also you wonder if there are as many different interpretations of some of these texts as there are readers. It's possible for people to read the same thing or see a mystic or the Ars Notoria and interpret it in many different ways too.
Yeah. There's a copy of Agrippa in Wolfenbüttel when he has these famous diagrams which are connected to Leonardo's of Vitruvian men. And the reader of this, who's a Benedictine named Heinrich Duden, thinks they're actually about breaking on the wheel and comments on them as if they are illustrations of, in some way, of the form of torture and execution that has you bound on a wheel and broken with bars. It's a very strange reading, but in other ways, he's a very precise reader of Agrippa. So I think that illustrates the way that readers can really depart from anything explicit in the text.
Mm. I'm just, how are we doing for time, Francois? How about Francois? Do I still have a bit more time?
We're doing very well,
We're doing well. Okay.
and I'm very keen to hear some comments on these two images you asked me
Yes.
to bring and which I'm contemplating with many interrogations.
Yes, sure. Well, I picked them partly the one on the right. It's actually a Greek text, which was I was trying to find something in the public domain, but I wanted something that represented those earlier medieval traditions of magic. So it's a 15th century magic text. Um, just to kind of illustrate the way we've been talking about the Renaissance may go, drawing on these earlier traditions. And one of the things you talk about in the book is not only the kind of big thinkers, people like Roger Bacon and Albertus Magnus, but it's also the kind of the slightly lower magic of the grimoires, the books like the Munich Handbook that Richard Kiekeffer edits in Forbidden Rites. So I wanted something that represented that. The other one is from Ulrich Molitor's treatise, early-ish 1480s, so early-ish treatise on witchcraft. And that was because I wanted to ask something about witchcraft if we have a bit of time. Obviously, this is a sort of fairly stereotypical depiction. If you think about early modern witches, you've got these two kind of slightly creepy looking ladies with a cauldron doing unspeakable things with chickens and snakes and what have you. And one of the things you do raise this, and you raise it particularly with some of your thinkers, is that at the very same time as they're writing these texts, they've got this new kind of intellectual self-confidence about talking about magic. This is the same time that witch trials are starting to ramp up on a larger scale. They begin kind of in the 1430s, but slowly increase into the late 15th, 16th centuries. And Agrippa certainly talks about that and talks about witchcraft, but to what extent do they regard this as similar or related? Do they see themselves as doing something completely different and therefore witchcraft is not a concern? I wanted to ask a little bit more about how this relates to those developments going on at a very similar time.
Yeah, witchcraft certainly becomes a concern later in the magical tradition. It's very much one for Della Porta in the first edition of his Natural Magic. And he is concerned to explain some of the phenomena of witchcraft as part of the task of writing
Yeah.
a natural magic. So, but I think in the early period that I'm looking at here, these are in a way parallel
Mm.
stories. I mean, the story of witchcraft in this period, there are trials, but it's more the coalescence of a theory And as magic is also in some ways the coalescence of a theory with particular powerful representatives, witchcraft also has powerful writers from Kramer, who from well, and before him from down to the end of the 14th century, but especially Kramer, who has a kind of ghastly vividness, and Giovanni Battista Pico, who has that extraordinary dialogue in which a witch supposedly actually speaks. So I think that in each case, there's an effort to take some of the phenomena and fold them into a theory which explains them and gives you their significance, though the directions and meanings of the theories couldn't be more different.
Yeah, it's curious, isn't it? There's because they do seem to be parallel. I misspoke, didn't I? It's Pico and not Agrippa who talks about witchcraft. But yeah, they do seem to run very much in parallel, which is, I mean, it's kind of curious to a modern. Maybe it's more curious to a modern observer than it would have been to them, because for us, we look at it's easy to look at it and think, oh, it's all magic. How did they not realize that this was all the same?
Well,
But yeah, for them, it seems really different.
Agrippa famously interfered with a witch trial in Metz, though the story is
Mm,
less dramatic, apparently, than it used to be portrayed. And he seems to have seen the developing demonology as contrary to his positive understanding of magic. But there are a couple of crossovers. There's a wonderful article by Carlo Ginzburg, published more than 50 years ago in a Festschrift and often overlooked, in which he tells the story of Anastasia la Frappona, who's a witch whom a male poet teaches about doing suffumigations. And
mm,
this has been more recently discussed a bit by Matteo Duni, who's done wonderful work on the Modenese Inquisition, which is where this is recorded. And there you have a woman doing a kind of magic which is more associated with male than with female practices, and being taught by a male. And that's just an extraordinarily interesting moment. He manages to slide out of his own Inquisition trial, but there one gets a sense that there must have been more crossings over than we know about.
mm,
Certainly, Tritemius, in his 8 questions with the Emperor Maximilian, has passages which very much cross over with the Malleus Maleficarum, and which deal with some of the same issues about the nature of the lesser demons who bother you but aren't actually going to make you damn your soul. So there's certainly there are points of contact, but it really seems as if there are these two strange moments. The theories come together in the late 15th and early 16th century, and then the great age of learned magic is really starts a couple of decades before the big push of witch
mm.
prosecutions, and both go on deep into the 17th century. So I've never felt able to account for the way in which these things sort of go along almost together, but they do seem to.
Yeah, and often with very different sets of people, although, as you say, you suspect there was probably more crossover in practice than we get to hear about.
When
But
I was
yes, baffles
young,
me too.
when I was young, the rise of learned magic was often cited as one of the reasons for the rise of the identification and persecution of witches. But I don't think that works terribly well chronologically. I
No,
do think they're really more simultaneous than the one after the other.
yeah. I think François has changed the picture. I think that's probably our cue to move on to thinking about some slightly later thinkers. And we've got
Absolutely.
Agrippa
Okay.
here, haven't we?
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Tony, for this wonderful book, and for the many insightful things you're saying. And just on the discussion we were just having, what is new? Obviously, at least as far as I can see it, many of these natural magi were very eager to prosecute witches, because that was the part of magic they disapproved of. I mean, it is a rhetoric. You also have in these books on plants in the 16th century. They always say, well, the apothecaries are incompetent, and the women who collect these herbs have no clue, and they are actually only witches, and we have to go back to Theophrastus and to his book on plants, and we have to identify these plants and to wrestle this really off from the hands of these incompetent wise women and necromancers and all the people we really don't like.
Yeah, my early people don't seem to be engaged in that so much as I think the 16th century natural magi, who of course become more varied in lots of ways.
Yes, but it is. I think it is really. I mean, I always tend to think, and I would be very curious, really, to hear what you think, that the early publication of Pliny's works was really vital, because that really made people realize that there was a kind of Mediterranean Egyptian tradition that was still, to a certain extent and in distorted ways, especially in the south of Italy, very much alive.
Yeah, Pliny is everywhere and and conveys immense amounts of information. And he also gives a kind of respectable Latin framework in which when the Picatrix is translated into Latin, when works of Islamic magic or divination or astrology are translated into Latin, there's a kind of respectable framework to put them in. You can see that these are a Roman gentleman could have been, very interested in these things and chased them down.
And I mean, I was really fascinated how you were fleshing out with Ficino and Pico the big differences between these two men in a very audible way, I would say, and in a very synthetic way, uh, uh, especially on the issue of Kabbalah and of astrology.
Yeah, I mean, I do see astrology as having a vital, though slightly strange relation to the magical tradition, because I don't think there's any requirement to be a magician to practice astrology. And many professors in medical schools, for example, would, teach astrology to their pupils as part of the medical curriculum, without necessarily in any way thinking about astrology as the key to world history or the explanation for the appearance of Jesus or so on. Some did, but I think many didn't. They simply taught it as a formal set of methods for predicting individual and collective futures or for working out what was likely to happen at a particular moment. And yet, um, so much of magic has an astrological uh, basis to it. The talismanic magic is, is generally, I think, a magic that is about communicating with planetary and other spirits, and this is something which is always, at best, very dodgy, but very widely disseminated. One thing that makes Pico in his later years such a dissenter from the normal tradition is his eventual rejection of the tradition of Ptolemaic and systematic magic, astrology, excuse me. And this is an incredibly complicated subject which Darrell Rutkin is unraveling for us with wonderful patience and precision. I don't think any will ever understand this until his whole multi-volume book is out, as it's such a detailed and precise investigation, text by text. But it does seem to me that this is a fascinating point of difference between the two of them. And Pico's, some of the grounds of Pico's critique and description of astrology run through 16th century science in a really powerful way. It's really extraordinary how down to Kepler. I mean, this is seen as an incredibly precise, serious, systematic critique of astrology in the way that others aren't. And it's remarkable that two men who in so many other ways have vast amounts in common could differ so much on this.
And that leads me to that question. I mean, we have been already tackling the issue, which is probably tantamount to magic, and that's ambivalence. I mean, Ficino wholeheartedly, obviously embraced astrology. It is very, very important for his Plotinian cosmology, the Neoplatonic Stoic cosmology he is embracing as a general world model, also to explain his Plato. And so I don't know what you think, and this is really a question to all of you. I mean, we are as ambivalent about the new media as early modern people seem to have been about magic or about the art of building or about all the kind of about these kinds of spectacles. I don't want to be completely ahistoric about that, but it's just something to make palpable for us, so tangible, the kind of tension that is in there. Because I mean, the people who embraced magic in the 16th century, and Agrippa's image has already been looming here on the beautiful screens François has been preparing. Agrippa's going to bring both Kabbalah, which was Pico's idea about how to do magic, and Ficino's astrological, cosmological, and noetic version together to coincide in a very, very unstable unity. But what do you think about this? I mean, I think it's very, very difficult to tackle ambivalence.
It is difficult, and ambivalence operates here in so many ways. One really fascinating area for me, which I can't claim to understand, is how Christian thinkers are understanding and trying to use Jewish tradition in this period. Because it seems to, I mean, on the one hand, there's always a kind of Jewish trace in magic, as there is of other languages from outside and also of non-languages from outside the Latin world. And there's a good chapter on that in the Big History of Medieval Magic. And on the other hand, it does seem that in the 15th and 16th century, Kabbalah and a kind of operationalized Christian foreshortened version of Kabbalah becomes really a kind of central part of the claims of people like Agrippa to have powerful knowledge. And becomes enormously important in 16th century practices of magic. Yet, once again, Pico is making his discoveries at, in the Italy of the murder of Simonino of Trent and the destroy in 1476 and the destruction of the Trent Jewish community, and more generally in the period which sees the beginning of sees the expulsion of Jews from Iberia, and also Sicily, which is really important, great Jewish communities whose inhabitants have to pass through Italy as they leave, and it's also of the beginnings of the confinement of Jews in Italy. They're being set apart from other inhabitants of cities where they've been since Roman times. So once again, I know Carlo Ginzburg has argued that the notion of the witch's Sabbath may owe something to the Jewish Sabbath. So once again, it's hard to understand this. Pico is clearly, as always, a very distinctive case because he has clear personal intellectual relationships with Jews. Both practicing Jews and converted Jews, whereas most people's Jews are imaginary. There, they meet them in texts, but he meets them in real life. He deals with them. He has this very complex relationship with Flavius Mithridates, his translator, who is a fascinating character. I think, very clearly the group of wonderful scholars who've been editing his manuscripts from the Vatican at last have taught us that he's a serious Christian convert, which was something that hadn't been really. I think the term convert had been used always with a kind of scorn. So the Christianizing of Kabbalah is already going on in his translations for serious reasons, because if Kabbalah is going to be a powerful engine for Christians, it's got to be compatible with Christianity. But it's such a complex, muddled relationship, and it's one that I really can't claim to have a deep handle on. What is clear, it seems to me, is that magic is one of the things that propels the transformation. Sorry, Kabbalah, and more generally Hebrew forms of non-semantic exegesis, you could say, are one of the engines that help propel magic into being an art in a new way. But it's a bit strange that can happen.
And only in, as he was saying, in a very particular way, because I mean, as far as I understand it, it was basically the Christians were interested in gematria. So in the science of numbers, which would bring me finally, or which would bring me, as I see the handle on the clock is progressing very fast to what you have been saying about the kind of handbook of Agrippa. We have it here, the Occulta Philosophia Libri Tres, 3 books on occult philosophy, which, I mean, you still can buy this in esoteric shops in translations. It's a kind of handbook for occultists, for all sorts of people, and it makes an exciting reading. But as you were fleshing out, Agrippa is quite an unlikely person from his biography to write such a thing and to come up with such a synthesis.
And someone who was an engineering consultant to people who had mills, and I mean, to us again, this doesn't seem like a plausible combination, yet it seems clear to me, and it's been argued that this combination, the idea that somehow engineering and natural magic go together, is still part of the way in which John Wilkins thinks about natural magic and human power, in the very different world of the New Royal Society. So I do think there's and it's in a way much easier to connect it with Athanasius Kircher, who clearly has his connections to that tradition as well as to the wonderful tradition of fraudulent marvels.
And but you are assessing, so to say, Agrippa's synthesis as a very very daring and bold one, really. Because obviously, I mean, Agrippa is not just talking about natural magic. That's just the first book. So magic with Agrippa becomes reinserted in a theurgical context.
Absolutely. And you get new ways of doing things, talismanic magic that rests on the power of Hebrew words and divine names, for example, where he's drawing on Reuchlin, though taking Reuchlin's work in his own direction. We're very lucky to have one of the few really good editions of a great Renaissance magical work, Vittoria Perona Compagni's edition of Agrippa, which makes it, it doesn't list every source, which would have been impossible, but it lists a great many of them, and it lets you at any given point see how the text evolves from its early state in the 1510 or so manuscript to the final versions that go through the press, 2 decades later. So but I think, again, there's room for a lot more work on Agrippa than has been done. It just seems to me, I always felt I was only scratching the surface of this really fascinating character. One thing I would love to see is a survey of copies of De Occulta Philosophia with evidence for use. and to see what people actually made of it in directly responding to it, what sorts of manuscript excerpts, there are quite a few there are, and what those reveal. That would be a huge job, rather like the wonderful survey of Vesalius's editions of copies of Vesalius or Copernicus that came out some years ago. But I think it would be equally revealing.
I think you did a wonderful job with your marginalia on marginalia, because you're really presenting Agrippa's book through the eyes of a reader, and this is absolutely something that is highly insightful. I mean, from my perspective, working on Della Porta, when I'm reading some of his books, I'm always amazed what people seem to have been interested in, at least the copies. Yeah, for instance, here in the Phytognomonica, his a physiognomy of plants, the copy in the National Library and in the University Library of Vienna. I'm usually working in Vienna. It has no real marks. I mean, there's not very much markup. But what is then very often marked are recipes how to dye your beard. This is very important. And as you know, there are lots of fake encomia in lode di quelli che si tingono la barba, so to say, in praise of people who dye their beards and so on. It comes up with many other
Oh, fascinating.
So
Joseph
this is quite
Gallagher.
interesting. Very practical recipes. What you can really do. This seems to have interested people much more than the kind of weird theories. I mean, this is just from his physiognomy of plants. I mean, Della Porta was a physiognomist, and he was very interested in physiognomies. The usual things, you know, you have seen them. I mean, it's not just faces of cocks and men and so on, but it's even distillation. It's even an ursale. This is an alembic for the distillation of very coarse things, and it's called an ursale, a bear-shaped face, and it has also the shape of the bear because the nature of the bear is very crude and very brutal. So this is a little bit of Della Porta's universe.
Yeah. Yeah, Della Porta seems to me to be a prime case in point of someone who, as he develops the Magia Naturalis, makes it much more of a sort of useful work than it starts out. I mean, it starts out very short, very challenging sometimes about things like the flight of witches, but the final editions just become this immense compendium, full of everything from very traditional magical recipes to very contemporary technological devices. And in a sense, he may more than anyone makes the case that these traditions come together in Renaissance magic.
They most certainly do. And again, I mean, I think this is why I gave you this frontispiece. François, if you could just switch to the other one, because here you really have, I mean, it's wonderful. We have these two title pages. I mean, the one is just a frontispiece, not a title page. The authors, the two authors' portraits, I mean, they differ about 90 years. This is about the one on the right side of Della Porta's is from 1609, and the other one is from 1530, I guess. Yes, it must be from the 1530 edition, isn't it? Yeah. So what you really can see is that the vast interests that are already present in Agrippa's book are here really visually represented. So if you go, well, François, you're one of you. So here you have at the bottom you have the alembics, and then you have writing in ciphers, of which you make very much with Tridemius, but also with as a magical art, and you have works on fortification. You mention that Agrippa was a soldier. And obviously there's optics, and if you move a little bit farther up to about 2 o'clock on this watch, we have geometry and mirrors. So and then we have physiognomy and astrology at 1 o'clock. Then in the middle we have the marvels of the natural world, the elephants, which can do marvelous things, find medicines for themselves, have a prodigious memory. And then here at 11 o'clock, you have these wonderful faces from Della Porta's physiognomy. The faces of human beings. I've already given you one of these images. And then you have the various magical properties of all kinds of strange animals. And a very important and often neglected part is actually agriculture. And you mentioning that too, I mean, that natural magi really defined themselves in terms of being farmers, really, whose knack or whose special prowess, be it as alchemists or be it as magicians, consisted in speeding things up or slowing things down.
Yeah, this is really beautiful. Thank you. That was really, really beautiful. One of the things that strikes me is this passion for reading things. You read you read the heavens, you read talismans, you read ciphered messages, you read physiognomies. There's this long tradition of both creating and discovering and then deciphering languages and alphabets of every kind. That clearly is something that, again, comes into the magical tradition, I would argue, in the 15th century. And the sort of technical cipher part of it really comes in a bit from the outside, from someone like Alberti, who is both an experimenter and an employee of the papal curia, where ciphers had been used for centuries.
I
So,
think yeah. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you. I think you
oh,
bring that out admirably, and let us not, with your chapters or your many pages on Alberti in that book, which I really appreciated, because I mean, writing in ciphers is a technique of power, and these magicians, be they alchemists who said that they could make artificial gold, they were assets. They were like, well, I don't want to mention some contemporary figures who produce interesting things, more or less interesting things. But we certainly all have some individuals on our minds who acquire very powerful positions. So obviously, Della Porta also wrote this, as you're mentioning, the treatise on ciphers. So there is also this kind of joy in coding, encoding, and decoding, and breaking codes, in making up codes, but in breaking up codes, in breaking codes. That unites early modern magic, learned magic.
yeah, I think that's very true. There's one more thing I'd like to mention just very quickly, which is, I think, the suspension of disbelief, which is, of course, a great feature of theater and ritual in this period, as in ours. Because it does seem to me that that plays an important part with practicing magi like Faustus, that the same suspension of disbelief which allowed the church to have crucifixes in which the statue of Jesus moved and was wounded and looked at people, and there was a great deal of this. And of course, the people who went on pilgrimages to see these objects were, this was a performance, and I think they were able to suspend disbelief and come into the performance rather than to be deceived by it in some way. But it does seem to me that that helps to explain the possibilities for magical performers, because the church is always putting on these great performances in which you suspend disbelief and you see the assumption of the Virgin or the assumption of Jesus into the heavens of a Florentine church.
Certainly.
Well, in fact, speaking of representation and performances, as we're coming to an end of our conversation, I thought it would be nice to mention the subject of magic and the arts. And I brought two pictures which to me correspond to the two extreme of the spectrum. On the one hand, on the left-hand side, you have the work of a court artist, that is someone who constantly produces drawing for all sorts of things, and we invent machines for festival. That's an example of a kind of sea monster invented for an entry in Antwerp. And in this case, my sense is that magic is really the servant of artistic imagination. This is the driving force. Now, if we look at the work of artisans, and I brought I brought an example. Oh, no, I'm messing everything up. I brought an example from Bernard Palissy, who is an artisan that writes. And I think there's a fundamental difference, that is, instead of telling others what to do with drawings, that's what court artists do. They present drawings to all sorts of artisans. Artisans directly engage with matter, and if you read someone like Palissy, they think that soils, mineral, plants, and animals are literally endowed with consciousness. So their work is not about inserting form into matter, intelligent thing into inert thing. It's on the contrary, having a relationship with a substance which they consider intelligent and reactive. So in this respect, I would understand that the artisan perspective is very different from that of the disegno culture, but also from the standard of early modern beliefs, which are based on, body and mind opposition, and also on the assumption of the superiority of man over creation, and really man rather than humans. So do you think that it is precisely the contribution of artisan culture to approach nature precisely outside this philosophical confine of the standard, body and mind Aristotelian theory? So long question, but...
I'd like this a lot. There's a wonderful article in the issue of Renaissance Quarterly that's just appeared by Jeremy Schneider on Palissy, showing that Palissy was perfectly aware that species disappear when humans overfish them or overhunt them, which is something that's not very easy to reconcile with a standard Aristotelian view of the natural world. But he experienced it, and he was talked about it with experts who did fishing, and he was able to draw this quite radical conclusion. So yes, and of course there's the work of Pamela Smith, particularly about the particular worldview of people who worked with their hands. And I'm very much inclined to believe this. I think once again there are crossovers of interesting kinds, and someone like Palissy is fascinating precisely because he finds a voice to describe some of his ways of seeing the world, which is unusual. There are some interesting examples of artisanal use of drawing. Heidi House, in her recent book on the surgery and artificial limbs, has some fascinating discussion of the way in which drawings did and did not transmit information about how to make an artificial hand that would actually function. Palissy plays a role there too. So I do think there's crossover, but I agree. Someone like Alberti is clearly doesn't think like an artisan. He has artisans who tell him things. He learns from them. So when he talks about when you harvest different kinds of stone and how long you have to leave them to mature before you can use them. We know that he's talking to the people with whom he worked, and we have one of his letters to the actual builder of the Tempio Malatestiano. So there is communication, but there are different ways, I agree, of dealing with the world. I think one of the great fascinations is with some of the greatest of the artists who are also great workers in material. I mean, Michelangelo comes to mind with the non finito as a way of really bringing the material into the sculpture. My colleague Carolina Mangone has written wonderfully about this. So it does seem to me that they're not unconnected, but I agree with this general point, and I do suspect that again, someone like Agrippa is very much on the court artist side of things rather than the artisanal side. And as I, like many Americans of my generation, worked as an artisan for some years during university in order to be able to eat during the summers, I have great sympathy for people who learn the properties of wood and metal by actually making things out of them. This is powerful knowledge. I wasn't a very good artisan, but I did learn a lot.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Well, the clock says it's time to open the panel to the question of the audience. So I would invite you to send me your question through the chat, and then I will pass them to the panel. And in fact, we already have a question from Anita Sherman, which goes as follows. Would you say that Jean Baudin's thought on demonology and learned magic are intertwined or parallel? Would he be an example of a labile and flexible thinker?
Very much so, it seems to me, and fascinatingly, he's somebody who tries out every known way of thinking about time and history, often really brilliantly. He's quite independent. He is the demonologist who believes that it may be possible for witches with demonic help to actually change the bodies of their victims, which is a very distinctive belief. Uh, but and he engages, what always fascinates me is he engages in sharp controversies against historical astrology, against Cardano, for example, but it passionately investigates numerological ways of specifying the likely duration and future of states, which are liable to many of the same kinds of objections in retrospect, that they kind of depend on confirmation bias. They depend on certain and examples existing which seem to confirm their powers. But I think Baudin is, he is at his he can be extraordinarily brilliant and precise and observant, and also extraordinarily gullible. If I just have one more sec, when he writes his chapter denying the existence of a golden age at the beginning of human time, he draws much of his evidence from Thucydides, from the beginning of Book One of Thucydides, where Thucydides argues that the Homeric campaign for Troy was much smaller in scale than the Peloponnesian War of his own time, and much of his material from the great forger Annius and Giovanni Nani of Viterbo, and he mixes these two sets of material together in a very fruitful way, and that's always seemed to me to be very typical of him.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't see any more questions in the chat, and I wonder, maybe something is coming. Yeah, how much would you link actors and magic is the most recent question. How would you link actors and magic?
Well, in lots of ways. I mean, partly because actors are the great creators of suspension of disbelief, and clearly were that in the 16th century, and in public theaters particularly, but also perhaps in some of the masks that have a certain magical content. Um, what always strikes me is that in America, you're always sort of led to think of Shakespeare because he is we honor him. We don't read him as much as we used to, but we honor him as being a total skeptic, since the fault, Brutus, lies not in our stars, but in ourselves. I can call spirits from the vasty deep. Well, says Hotspur, so can I, so can any man, but will they come? But, in fact, the spirits do come and play music. I think the theater has always had a magic about it, which helps to allow you to ignore the tatty scenery and the tatty costumes and the boys playing women that you would have had, say, on an Elizabethan stage, and really be taken into the magic of a story. Incidentally, as I worked, my artisan work was mostly done in theaters, and I don't think I ever knew an actor who didn't believe in many forms of magic. Professional or amateur, they all did. So it does seem to me that the power of the theater, the mask, the procession are connected in some way with the rise of magic, not causally, but people are responding to some of the same things.
Okay, thank
If
you.
I might add,
Yeah,
if I may add something, it is, I mean, obviously a magical show is a performance, and the trickster magicians were performers. They were very good performers, and learned magicians didn't like them always or necessarily. But I mean, people who wrote about magic sometimes even wrote for the theater. Giordano Bruno wrote a comedy where he makes really ruthless fun of magic, and yet it's full of
Laporta
magic.
has the
And Della
astrology.
Porta has written 17 plays. 17
One of them a
plays.
satire of astrology.
Yes, it is a satire and it isn't, because, I mean, obviously all his actors, for instance, are full of physiognomical traits, very characteristic traits. So magic is a form of self-fashioning in show business, and even more so when the magician happens to be a courtier or an aspiring courtier in the later 16th century.
Absolutely right. Agrippa talks briefly about a method of projecting a message onto the moon. And we had a workshop at Princeton with a professional magician and psychologists who specialize in perception. And they were able to work out a way of doing that seemed we weren't able to test it, but they were quite convinced that this would work quite effectively. And it was a combination of taking advantage of the great darkness of the world in that period and the brightness and size of the full moon with the characteristics of certain colors and the patter of the magician. So.
okay, thank you. We have quite a few questions now in the chat. In a chronological order, the following one from Eleanor Smith. I understand historians are starting to see early modern alchemy more and more separate from magic. How often does alchemical and magical practices mix in your experience?
Many people are very interested in both. Tritemius did very influential work on alchemy. Agrippa is very interested in alchemy. But I do believe they are separate traditions, not unrelated, but separate. I think the greatest single discovery in the history of early modern science in my lifetime has been the discovery collectively made by Lawrence Principe, William Newman, my colleague Jennifer Rampling, and others. Alchemy is an applied science, and you can reconstruct its procedures in a rigorous way and obtain the results that you're supposed to return. You're supposed to gain. And these are people who are incredibly meticulous about making no claims that they can't substantiate experimentally. And Jennifer is my only colleague in history who has her own lab elsewhere in the university. And I do think that these are really separate. I mean, alchemy is something like metallic crystal in chemistry. Everything is hidden under false names, decknamen, and under myths and under poetic treatments. But when you crack them, you get a series of steps to take with identified ingredients that lead to identified results. And you don't have that slipperiness in magic that indicates that that just magic is just a different kind of enterprise. Certainly the same people are interested, but I think the really clearly important thing is that alchemy survives into the world of the Royal Society, and it's a major interest for Newton and others who really do not have much time for magic anymore, but they do have time, a lot of time for alchemy because they see that it can actually work. So I think I agree. I think that's been a huge discovery of the last several decades in the history of science, just a magnificent one.
Okay. And now a question from Raffaella Garitano. I would like to know if the magical practices of the 15th century in any way influence or are linked to Christian prayer. For example, is there a link in the possibility of invocation and of in the possibility of invocations and visions of spirits and divinity?
They look awfully similar a lot of the time. It looks, ascetic practices are called for in the Ars Notoria. There are also practices that the living saints, the young women who live on the host or on nothing, and mystics engage in. So you have similar practices. You have sometimes similar results. Visions of heaven, for example. Francesca Romana had a vision of heaven. So did some practitioners of the Ars Notoria, according to the treatises that Claire Fanger and others have worked through and in some cases published for us very usefully. Someone like Tritemius is a really interesting case since he is a Benedictine, a priest, an abbot, and a magus. And he invented a couple of teachers and wrote treatises under their names on the Ars Notoria, in which it's very hard to tell whether what he is offering is a form of Christian contemplative experience or a form of magic of the Ars Notoria. And I'm not sure he saw a big difference between the two. That may have been one of the things that made him so problematic to the members of his first monastery at Eschbornheim.
I can come in on that as well. I mean, the two are very much intertwined. If you go into not just learned magic, but also popular magic, there's a lot of work being done recently on things like healing charms. They invoke the saints, they use Christian prayers, they invoke bits of the Bible, and it becomes a very, very grey area. You get churchmen who try and draw the line between, well, this is legitimate and this isn't, but there's a huge kind of grey area that you might call popular piety. Keith Thomas famously called it the magic of the medieval church, but there is this kind of practical use of religious ritual that's very, very common in society.
Yeah, and this is the point where you really wish you could just ask, someone, like Tritemius, could you just explain to me,
Why did you do that?
But we can't quite do that.
Any thought about the significance of circles in magic in the context of other geometric form as relevant? So, for instance, pentagons, circle symbolism, association. What's the importance of geometrical figure and in particular the circle in magic practice? Question from Kate Bassett.
Well, that goes right back to the Middle Ages. I mean, that's a huge part of magical practice going back, I think, as far as we know anything about it. Catherine, do you have a thought about that?
I mean, yes, you're right. It's right through learned magic. And I mean, often the circles are protective, aren't they? They're to either stop spirits getting to you stand in the circle, or they are to keep the spirits in the circle, to keep it away from you. But yes, I probably don't have any great thoughts on the different kinds of geometric patterns that are used. It's interesting. They're clearly designed, aren't they? It's not just draw any old circle. There's clearly careful planning and design. Actually, the person who would know, I don't know if he's here or not. I've just examined a thesis from Stockholm by a guy called Andrea Franchetto, who's looked at the use of space in ritual magic. And he has interesting things to say about the kind of the drawing of the circles. I don't think he gets into the geometry of it, but he's quite interested in the fact that these things don't just happen. They are planned, they're carefully designed, and they're transmitted. So I would go and look at his work.
That's already a great advance, putting this into a site and talking about the nature of the site.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
And obviously the circle is an image of cosmology.
Yeah.
It's obviously, I mean, you have it with the Lullian wheels, and I mean, it's a Pythagorean image or Pythagorean image. It's the cosmos, and obviously, what the magicians or many magicians try to do is to have circles that imitate the cosmos. So this is, and it's a perfect form which you can quite easily draw.
And
it's not
I mean,
very
circular
difficult.
Diagrams are all over. Sorry, François.
Yes, but even on the Earth, you need a piece of rope and a nail and some chalk, and you have that perfect form. It's very easy to construct, isn't it?
One of the things that's fascinating about Alberti, I think this comes out in the book recently published by Reaction, but is that he uses discs for so many different things. He uses a disc for measuring the proportions of the body and for examining sculpture, for enciphering messages, for doing the plan of the city of Rome. He even made a circular drill, which he used to drill porphyry, which was so hard to work, according to Vasari. And it didn't use it a lot, but for him, the circle is the form that is the form of the tool. And again, I don't know if that has any ideological meaning for him, but it is something that he goes to again and again.
Okay, thank you. We have more and more questions coming, so I might cut you a little bit short to
Sure.
give some space. So from Victoria Pfeiffer, thank you for putting this together. I wonder, based on Professor Grafton's previous research, if he could talk about some of the print culture behind books on magic and witchcraft. Were there levels of censorship, etc.? Thank you.
Oh yes, there are certainly levels of censorship, and there are huge struggles between the censors and the printers who print everything from Agrippa and other learned works down to these very popular divinatory books that just circulate and circulate beginning in the Middle Ages. And there's a very good book on divinatory books in Venice in the 17th and 18th centuries. They're still circulating very widely despite every effort to suppress them. So I do think that one of the things they illustrate is just the real difficulty of putting any of this back in its box once it's in print, because there's always going to be another colporteur and another printer.
Okay, thank
And
you.
let me add just one thing. I mean, and that's the translations into the vernacular. The authorities sometimes would consent to publishing a book in Latin, especially when it was written in erudite Latin, but they wouldn't like to see these books printed in the vernacular. I mean, for Italy, obviously, Venice was a safe haven because they had their own Inquisition and had a vital interest in keeping their publishing industry alive. But that was a very important issue, especially as the 16th century was wearing on and censorship became harsher and harsher with the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation.
Yeah.
Okay, one more question from Ariana Brunori. Do you think that there is a parallel between the distinction of a good alchemy and a bad so-called sophistical alchemy, which is a topos in alchemical literature? So is there a parallel between this and the distinction of good and bad magic?
Well, I think in Yeah, it's a very good question. I don't really know enough to answer it. What strikes me is that in alchemy there were real charlatans. That is, there was real alchemy which actually worked and can be reconstructed, but there were also charlatans. Tara Numedal has written a wonderful book about one of them, and studied others, female as well as male. So there are people who make who make the kinds of claim that we used to associate with alchemy, the making of gold and so on, and they are really charlatans. But I think the people who do the alchemy in its main traditions also, you're perfectly right. They like to distinguish between the proper way to do alchemy and the wrong way to do alchemy, independent of the existence of actual fakes. In magic, it's much harder to distinguish who's a real magus and who is a charlatan. Faustus, for example, did fake horoscopes. They were horoscopes with no planetary positions. So in that way, he's a fake, whereas someone like Napier, who does real horoscopes, or Foreman, who does real interrogations, is not in the same way.
Okay. Question continue to flow in. This one from Emil. It's a Neoplatonic question, I gather. Can you say anything about the reception of the theurgical tradition of Iamblichus in the early context of, in the early modern context of magic?
I don't know any, I mean, that his work is received, it circulates with other texts that are Plotinus, it circulates with Michapselus or Pseudopselus. So he's one of the this is one of the works that Ficino, for example, is most heavily interested in. So in that sense, yeah, he's absolutely present. Sergius, can you say something more?
I can a little bit, but I think it's Ficino. Ficino is very interested in him, and he translates him, and it actually really harks back to the other question on alchemy. I mean, there were very hard-boiled authors, chief testers of metals. They were writing these famous Probierbücher, of which several dozens appear during the 16th century, which really tell you to assess the quality of silver and of gold and of beer and of other substances. But then very often in these Probierbücher, they will obviously give you lots of instructions how to make alchemical processes and metallurgical processes. Very straightforward. But then they will say, well, if you are a true believer and if you have purified your mind as much as you can, you might be able to produce artificial gold with God's grace. And I think this is the basic idea where Jamblichus really comes in, or where Jamblichus or the whole theurgic tradition really creeps in, that you can really become a demigod, which obviously is unspeakable in the Christian religion. But then, on the other hand, there are all these saints who were working miracles. So there's a lot of openness towards Jamblichus, I would say.
Thank you. Another question from Penny. You spoke about people combining interest in engineering and magic at the same time. Is it possible that magic satisfied people's need to understand their existence? Magic, or could magic represent a spiritual world different from the one proposed by religion?
I don't I don't think there were many people who sort of chose magic against Christianity. I think they because the until sort of the 16th century, Christianity is so flexible and so accommodating in some ways to forms of ritual, to populating a universe with spirits of every kind, that you can kind of have both as long as you're careful. But you know, but it just doesn't seem to happen. One of the best areas for testing this is colonial New England. We have just generations of detailed studies based on relatively rich archives of the religious behavior of people in colonial New England, and it does seem that many of them felt perfectly capable of belonging to a strict sounding Protestant church with a very strict predestinarian theology, and they would go to the cunning man or be the cunning person, the cunning woman themselves when it came to finding something lost or finding out who was hurting their farm animals. Patricia Bonamy, who wrote a very good book on religion in the colonies, talks about a kind of flexible loyalty that you can move from one to the other. So each, of course, could satisfy you in different ways, but I don't think many saw it as a radical choice.
Well, also you get magical texts like the Ars Notoria, like something like John of Morony's Book of Visions, which are very much situated as kind of giving you more experience within that Christian context, deepening your relationship to God.
Yeah.
And the church often doesn't like these at all, but that's how they kind of presenting themselves, and that's how some of their readers might have taken them.
Okay, thank you. Vienna asked us, sorry for the uninformed question, but would it be possible to ask about the role of cats in magic when they were first mentioned as linked to witchcraft, if they were, and if they have any other role? I am particularly interested to know about text around the time of Della Porta, as I recently read a little bit about Phytognominica, that is unicorn horns, etc., but did not see any cats as far as I can remember. And thank you in advance for your considerate answer. Maybe Sergius, I see you.
Yeah, you seem to have something.
It's funnily, I mean, Della Porta has no cats, and you're very right. Of course, he talks a lot about lions and lionesses and tigers and other feline animals, and but he doesn't have this idea of the spiritus familiaris, which is probably what you're pointing at. The paredros, that is actually a remnant from Greek, from ancient Greek magic, but there it was usually a bird. An eagle or some other bird, which would connect you to some kind of to some kind of higher demonic entity, and I think it has survived in the form of a cat. There's obviously the dog of Dr. Faustus and all these, but Della Porta has quite a few recipes which you probably won't like, will dislike as much as I do, because I too seem to like cats. And these, unfortunately, these recipes are about with cat's brain as an aphrodisiac and as a love charm, which is used by prostitutes, and they are feeding them their clients so they will come back. So cats are, yeah.
Okay, yes. Tony, do you want to make further comment on the cats? Or?
No, except that antiquarians had cats. This was a known thing. You know, your basic antiquarian had a vast collection of books and objects and always a cat.
Okay, thank you. We have time, I think, for two more questions, not more. So one from Somnath Basu. Question, were there differing perception about magic practiced by the nobility and the upper classes and magic practiced by the working classes? I'm thinking about example like the magic practiced by Faustus and that practiced by Robin.
Absolutely. The magic of the working classes was often much simpler in its ingredients, in its methods, in its ceremonies. You get a wonderful case is the effort of Tommaso Campanella and Pope Urban VIII to avert the effects of eclipses, of a solar eclipse, which involved creating a kind of dance of clerics holding torches and moving in particular ways. So Fabio Barri, in his fascinating book on color Taylor in architecture argues that magical considerations often determined the choice of precious colored stones in altars and in buildings. In Rome, of course, if you were wealthy and building a palace by the Tiber, you had your horoscope painted in vast scale on the ceiling of the building. It's just a high investment, highly sophisticated kind of magical practice at that level.
Later on, those distinctions begin to break down a bit, don't they? Once you get magical texts in the vernacular, you get cunning folk reading them. So there's kind of change there as you go later.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And of course, there's um, sorry, there's a great thing in Aldous Huxley, but it's slipping my mind, so we need to finish.
Okay, well, we'll conclude with a question that really seems to be tailored for you, Tony. Are there authors who make explicit connection between the art of rhetoric and the art of magic, using words for ulterior goals beyond the intrinsic natural truthfulness of language from opponent as well as sympathizers of magic?
Yes, I think the image of the Hercules Gallicus, which is a very common emblematic image, is precisely an image of the magical power of language to compel people to follow the powerful speaker. Reuchlin has a beautiful passage about the way in which language can compel people's connection to you in a way that nothing else can. So, yeah, I think this is a very popular idea among rhetoricians and poets for sure.